And this restriction is valid. This means this is saying you that you can reduce all the first leg of all the variables at once. सबको आप इकट्ठा एक्सक्लूड कर सकते हो. So what to do next? I will reduce the size of this model, but there are many options to proceed. For example, this output is telling me that money supply growth is insignificant. I can try to reduce the two legs of money supply growth. This output is telling me that the second leg of variables is insignificant, so I can reduce the second leg of variables. This is also telling me that leg 1 of all variables is insignificant. I can try this. Right? So there is discretion what to do. But I am thinking that money supply might be irrelevant, so I am excluding money supply first, and then I will re-estimate the model to see what happens. By the way, what do you think inflation is determined of? What determines inflation? Most of the time when you ask this question in your class to your students, you will find the answer, it's money supply. The economists think that most important determinant of inflation is money supply. But empirics everywhere are telling that this is very loose determinant. Sometimes it will determine, sometimes it will not. For example, in the United Kingdom during 2020, they increased the money supply by 20%. And in 2020, there was no inflation in United Kingdom. In 21, they restricted the increase in money supply, but the inflation started rising. In 22, they actually squeezed the money supply. The money supply was reduced, but the inflation is historic high. So what we are learning in our books, sometimes exactly opposite of that is happening in the world. So let me see. I'm going to reduce the two legs of money supply to reduce this model. Let me do this. Money supply and then leg of money supply. I am reducing these two variables, and let me see what happens next. There is problem of autocorrelation at the border. This is close to 5%. Right? This means if there is some problem with diagnostic, I should reverse this act. No. 10% is very loose significance level, but in this top output you don't have 10%. It was significant at some. This was our first model, and there is no autocorrelation. Oh, sorry. We are working on the second file in this. It's significant at 5% level. If you are imposing some restriction and restriction is producing some kind of distortion in the diagnostic, then the action should be reversed. So if I am excluding money supply growth, this is creating the problem of autoregression. I should reverse this action. I should include the legs of money supply again and try to do some other restriction. I will include the money supply growth again, because if I reduce this, the diagnostic become distorted. And again, I'm doing dynamic analysis, which will tell me where to go. Right. Although it is saying that money supply growth is insignificant, but if I am reducing this money supply growth, the diagnostic become worse. So I have reversed this action. There is no other variable which can be excluded except the variable 7, which is actually inflation. This variable can be excluded. But probably it will also produce autocorrelation because this was introduced, the second leg of inflation was introduced to cut down the autocorrelation. So I am not in favor of eliminating second leg of inflation. So what to do? This output is further telling me that I can reduce all the first legs of variables. Let me do this. Formulate first leg of this thing. All these can be excluded simultaneously because the output is telling like this. The model is reduced. Now the autocorrelation problem is not there, and heteroscedasticity is not there, and the size of model is reduced by a significant proportion. Now there is only one leg of all variables which are there in the model. So you don't need to do the dynamic analysis again, because dynamic analysis is needed when you have more than one legs. There is only 0 leg of all the variables. There is no need of applying the dynamic analysis. This is telling me that interest rate is significant. The GDP growth is also significant. The import value index is significant. The exchange rate is significant, and money supply growth is insignificant. What does this mean? This means that the inflation is depending on its own leg, plus this is also depending on interest rate, plus this is depending on GDP growth, plus this is also dependent on import value index, and so and so. Right? And in what direction the if there was high inflation yesterday, today's inflation is likely to be less because the coefficient is negative. Right? If you have high interest rate today, the inflation is expected to be higher. Right? This is opposite to what the world is doing today. And then you have GDP growth. Basically, the Phillips curve theory says that if you have high growth, inflation will also be high. But here the output is opposite to this. This is saying that high GDP growth will lead to low inflation. And then there is import value index. If the import value index is increasing, this is basically the CPI for imported goods. Right? If this is going up, the inflation in domestic economy is naturally, it is bound to go up, and so on. Right? So all these things jointly determine inflation, and if I say inflation is determined only by the monetary factor, this is wrong. There are all these factors are jointly determining the inflation, so all of these should be included. If you ignore any one of these variables, this will introduce some kind of bias. Right? This is how you make the models. It is basically specification test. Yes. It says, look, you have linear model, you can take scale of these. Whether the scale of these models is more useful or just this kind of plain model is more useful. Basically, I have told you that this is basically specification test. What specification means, you can have non-linear function of the variables which are there in the model. This is testing whether this model is, the null hypothesis is this model is valid. The alternative hypothesis is some higher specification of the model is needed. Basically, for this Ramsey test, for this Ramsey test is specification is okay. H naught is specification is okay. And alternative is the specification is not okay. This means you need higher power of the variables which are there in the model. ठीक? But this is saying there is no need of extension. This model is okay. The null hypothesis is supported by the data.